Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Andrea Green, Director of the Visiting Artists Program here at SAIC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture featuring Natalie Chanin. SAIC's Visiting Artists Program is dedicated to hosting internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars each academic year to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art and culture. We're honored to have Natalie Chanin visit SAIC, and I would like to thank her for taking the time to be here and for sharing her extraordinary story with all of us this evening. I would also like to thank the Robert Lehman Foundation and the Illinois Arts Council Agency for their support of tonight's program, as well as extend a special thank you to Betsy and Jack Karp. At the end of the lecture, we'll take a few questions from the audience. Our staff will have microphones circulating, so please raise your hand so we can get a microphone to you. And then immediately following the lecture, we'll have a book signing in the lobby right outside the auditorium for Natalie's brand new book titled Alabama Studio Sewing Patterns, A Guide to Customizing a Hand-Stitched Alabama Chanin Wardrobe. So books are still available for purchase courtesy of the Museum of Contemporary Art store. And tonight's program concludes our season for the academic year, and I'd like to thank everybody who has been involved to help make these events possible. And stay tuned for teasers about our fall schedule, and keep an eye out for the announcement of the schedule, which will come out early this summer. So thank you again for joining us, and now I'd like to welcome to the podium Dan Price, Chair of SAIC's Sculpture Department, to introduce Natalie Chanin. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Graduation is right around the corner. At graduation, I often meet parents of my students, and they want to know, what will my daughter do with an art degree? I mean, what's it good for? I've come to be able to answer this question with relative ease. An art degree includes training in flexible thinking and problem solving. An art degree trains people to work collaboratively and spontaneously. Artists from the academy have learned to invent, to present, to critique, to fail, and to invent again. As Roberta Smith put it last spring in her own visiting artist talk, everybody has criticality. It is what we apply our analysis and taste concerns to that differentiates us. So if everyone has a critical apparatus, that means we can discern. We can choose. We like this, we don't like that. We buy this, we don't buy that. Our criticality can be an important filter for expressing our values in the face of a world of choices. But what if the thing that you value isn't on the list of choices? And this is where art school and design school comes back into play. Our critical apparatus can be employed not just at the end of the production, but rather it can inform our choices in making. It's possible to posit a critical position in the very making of something. And this important idea is what brings our visiting artist today. In the age of fast everything, the slow movement is taking hold. Contrary to what you might imagine, the slow movement is not about doing things slowly. It is about finding the right speed with which to do something in a way that values quality over quantity, long-term benefits over short-term gains, and the well-being of the many over the few. Proponents of the slow movement value thoughtful and considerate approaches over purely efficiency-driven processes. Our distinguished guest today, Natalie Chanin, uses the term slow fashion, and she puts it this way: the experience of making something with your hands cannot be overestimated. Anyone who tries to make even the most basic garment gains some understanding of what it takes to make a finished product from a raw material. It adds value to every dress in your closet or t-shirt in your drawer. But those who are not inclined to make can begin by reading the tags on the items you own and the ones you plan to buy. When you begin asking those important questions, where did this come from? Who made it? And how? That's at least a good start. Once you have that information, it's up to you to make smart choices about what you buy, who you buy from, and how often. Natalie Chanin is owner and designer of the American couture line Alabama Chanin. Natalie has a degree in environmental design from North Carolina State University She was a finalist for the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Fashion in 2005, a finalist for the CFDA Vogue Fashion Award in 2009, and the 2013 winner of the CFDA Lexus Eco Design Challenge. Natalie has published 4 books of her work and has founded a handful of companies and product lines, including Project Alabama, Alabama Chanin, and most recently, A. Chanin. Her designs for hand-sewn garments constructed using quilting and stitching techniques from rural America have been widely celebrated for their beauty and sustainability. These works give modern context to techniques that have been passed down through generations of women and men. Each collection emphasizes quality, detail, craftsmanship, and style, while each piece is a labor of love, signed by the artisan who's hand-stitched every seam. Now back to our original question. What can you do with an art or design degree? Natalie has made it as a maker, and in the process, she has become a pioneer in the current sustainable futures movement and an important proponent of corporate community and responsibility. Her work transcends the garments her company produces and engages crucial questions about corporate responsibility, workers' rights, slow fashion, and sustainability. Natalie is an artist with a real vision, and we are so lucky to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Chanin to the stage.
Man, it's going to be hard to follow that. I don't know that I've ever been as proud as I am this moment. I'm going to start these slides here. I just have a lot of slides that really show the work that we do, the people that have done the work, the place that we do them. They don't necessarily correlate with what I'm talking about at this moment, but if you get a little tired of what I'm talking about, you can watch the slides that are on the screen, and we will have some time afterwards to ask some questions. But I'm really probably the most unlikely person to speak in such a hallowed art institution. I used to always make this joke that I went to the art school of Pinky and Blue Boy. Now, those of you who know these 2 famous paintings will know that they really found their way into the culture of American art through these little trucks that used to come into my little hometown of Florence, Alabama. Florence is as north and as west as you can go and still be in the state of Alabama. And there's no major highway that goes through there. So I was born in the early 60s, and at this time, there were no art classes in our school system, and really the only art that I had access to were these framed pictures that you could buy at the local furniture store. These trucks would come in and they would just have stacks and stacks and stacks of paintings, or not paintings, but prints and kind of gold foiled frames. You could choose from either Tyrolean Hof, Jesus on the Rocks, Pinky and Blue Boy, or the Cameo Girls. That was a twin set that you could put side by side. Now, each one of these paintings was either in my grandparents' Perkins house or my grandmother Smith's house, and so that's really what I knew as art growing up. So, it is quite funny that I'm here, but what my grandparents did do, they really came out of a time when there was very little in rural America. And my next door neighbor, Mrs. Killen, once said, we were poor, but we didn't know it. And so my grandmothers and my grandfathers were the kind of people that grew every scrap, every piece of food that hit the table they had made. My grandmother made the bread, they grew the vegetables. In the summertime, I worked in the garden with them. Both of my grandmothers made every dresses their daughters ever wore. And so I grew up in this culture of making, which didn't seem abnormal to me at all. And after time, with a lot of distance between now and that time, I've come to understand that it's really something what I call living arts. Food, clothing, and shelter were really the way that people for millennia expressed themselves. And so what maybe I didn't get in art school, I really learned about the art of living and making through my grandparents, who were extraordinary makers. So after I graduated from high school, I really didn't know what to do, but I wound up by chance in Raleigh, North Carolina, and one day watching the TV, I saw a little PBS show about something called the School of Design, and as far as I know, that was about the first time in my life that I ever heard the word or thought of a designer as something you could do or be. And so I investigated the school, and I went and made an application to go to the School of Design and was immediately turned down. But I wasn't to be deterred, so I signed up for a two-dimensional design class for non-design majors and went through that program and came back the next possibility to apply for a program there with a small portfolio. And I always... I said this weekend at a workshop that I'm always a bit like the fool falling off the edge of the cliff. I don't necessarily have a great plan, but I always seem to be kind of headed in the right direction, and by some chance of luck, I fall in the right place at the right time. So I've always been a really avid reader, and I was reading a lot of D.H. Lawrence and some other writers of that era at the time, and my interview was the dean of the Department of Architecture, and she looked at my portfolio and sort of, looked a little strange. And then she looked at me and she said, "What do you do in your spare time?" And I said, "Well, I read." And I went on to tell her what I'd been reading, and she spent the rest of the interview time talking about Lawrence Sanders and admitted me to design school, and that really changed everything about my life. So I was in design school in the 80s, and I always feel like this is a time when designers went from lowercase d's to capital D's. Design suddenly became really important. There were names like Ettore Sotsas and the Memphis movement. There were designers in fashion like Machino who were really trying to push the edges of design. And this is really where I grew up in this era of design, or let's say I became fully formed in this era. I wound up with a degree in environmental design, which sounds much more fancy than it really is. At that time, North Carolina State University had grown out of the Black Mountain College, which was a Bauhaus center after many members of the Bauhaus had left Europe and came. And so the school was really worked in the Bauhaus fashion until right up at the beginning of the 80s. And at that point, some of the disciplines had really splintered away. And I came in at a time when there was these really great professors who thought it was really important to bring those things back. And so I was the first, myself and one other person, we graduated with this new degree called environmental design, which was really about designing for your environment, not necessarily for sustainability at that time. But it was a really amazing program for someone who really didn't have a background in art and design, because I was in studio classes with textile designers and product designers and graphic designers, and there's a really beautiful program there at the time that is now called the Annie Albers program, where you could do a double major in design and industrial textile design. And so I completed what today is known as the Annie Albers program, and had an amazing training in being able to produce textiles on a very large scale and on a very small scale. And I think as you look at the works that we do, you can really see that this program changed my life. After I graduated from NC State, I tried everything I could to find a job in our little community. I was a Southern girl at heart, and really wanted to stay close to home. but I wasn't able to find anything, and I wound up about 6 months after I graduated in a job on 7th Avenue in New York. I worked for a junior sportswear company. We were selling to stores like Macy's, and this was really, at the very beginning of fast fashion. And through this company, I kind of worked my way up the manufacturing ladder, and I was working in the design, and I eventually became responsible for samples and began to travel overseas in a lot of areas that we were making. And, it was really, was a real marked time of my life, because I traveled to places and saw things that people really should not see. Human beings treated in ways that human beings should not be treated, all in the name of dyeing a piece of fabric into the color blue, or printing a piece of fabric in a design that was going to be on a very inexpensive shirt that was going to hang, in a very fancy department store in New York City. And it really altered the way I saw design, right? Because I went from having this very starry-eyed ideal of being able to, make these beautiful things, to seeing the reality of what those things did to human beings and to communities. So I wound up leaving that side of design and really went over to the other side, and I have to say it wasn't much better. I went from one side of the camera to the other. I became a stylist, and this marks like another 10-year period of my life where instead of making the clothes, I was presenting the clothes for the consumer. So I spent 10 years doing television commercials and music videos and shooting catalogs. And, at some point I really realized in this process that I wasn't really happy with that either. It felt like it was the same kind of work, just, in a different place, in a different form. And I sort of hit a wall and took a sabbatical, and this is really where the story of Alabama Chanin starts. I planned a 4-month sabbatical away from my life, and went on this voyage to Venezuela and a truck. And the end of my sabbatical, I wound up in New York City. It had been some time since I'd lived in New York, and I wanted to see how it had changed and grown. And 1 month led to 2, and 2 months led to 3. And in the process of living in New York City, I started cutting apart T-shirts. I had been on sabbatical for about 4 months, and my bank account was kind of dwindling, and I didn't really have anything to wear that I felt was very fashion fancy, that felt like I could fit in New York. So I took this T-shirt out of my backpack and I cut it up, and I was living in a very tiny hotel room. I was living at the Chelsea Hotel in a very tiny room. The room was pretty much just big enough for a bed. So I had a little ironing board next to my bed where I cut the T-shirt up, and obviously I didn't have a sewing machine. So I sewed the T-shirt back together again, kind of forming it on my body at that time, and sewed it back together by hand. And I wore it to this party one night, and it was so funny because people would walk across the room and ask me, "What is that you have on?" and kind of touch me, which in New York City people don't really touch you. And I was really excited that people liked my design, but more than that, I woke up the next morning and I was really surprised at the act of making, right? I was a trained designer. I grew up in a culture of making, but it had been such a long time since I had made something with my own hands. And so I got up the next morning and I made another T-shirt, and sure enough, I wore it on the street, and people would stop me and touch me and ask me what I had on. And so I started making these T-shirts for friends, and for, this idea came about that I would like to see these 200 one-of-a-kind T-shirts all together in one place at one time. And so I started going around to manufacturers in New York City, and there are all these really beautiful embroidery studios. And so I started taking these kind of cut-up, recycled T-shirts to these embroidery studios in New York City. And I always say, I think they really thought I was a bag lady, because I would bring in these bags of cut-up T-shirts, and they really, nobody wanted anything to do with it. And so I was standing on a street corner on 8th Avenue and about 38th Street one day, and I was looking at the T-shirts, incredibly frustrated that I couldn't find anyone to help me make them. And I realized in that moment, like a brick on my head, that these looked exactly like a quilting stitch. And I knew lots of people back in Alabama who were my grandmother's friends who had been quilting since they were children, and that if I was going to get these T-shirts made, then I need to go home. And so I wrote this proposal for a project called Project Alabama. And Project Alabama, this project, again, really changed my life. So I raised some money, and I went home, and I ran a little tiny ad in the paper that said part-time hand sewing and quilting. And about 60 women called, and about 20 women stuck, and we cut up these T-shirts and we sewed them. And they were, I drove down to Alabama and collected recycled T-shirts all along the way down to Alabama and cut them up. And I had called my aunt from the Chelsea Hotel in New York to ask her for a house, if we could live in a house, she could find a house for me to do this project in. And at the same time I wrote the project for the T-shirts, I wrote a project for a short documentary film called Stitch about old-time quilting circles. So I had been working in the film industry quite a bit, and I had this idea for this very multimedia project that would show where this fashion comes from, so a social document of the time and the place where these things were made. And so I called my aunt, and she said, well, the house right on the other side of the barn is for rent. Would you like to move into this house? So I said, yeah, we'll take it, and drove in that night, and the house had been abandoned for about 5 years. They literally had, taken a chainsaw and cut their way in through the back door to get in, and these ladies would come to the back door and pick up little packages of T-shirt scraps, and they would bring back finished T-shirts, and I would pay them out of my pocket. And they all laugh today that it seemed like some sort of very strange, illegal dealings out the back door of this 3-bedroom brick ranch house on County Road 200. But so we made our 200 T-shirts, and they were amazing. And we took them to New York, and I showed them the T-shirts and a trailer for the documentary film. It was Fashion Week, February 2001. And one of the first people to come through the door was Sally Singer from Vogue and Julie Gilhart from Barney's New York. And Julie brought her buyers back, and they looked at the T-shirts, and they said, we'll take 12 like this, and 12 like this, and 12 like this. And I was like, wait a minute, these are one-of-a-kind pieces. This is, kind of an art project, right? And they said, it doesn't matter, just make something like this. And so I called our ladies who had done the sewing back in Alabama. I called them and I said, what do you guys think? Would you, like to make more of these T-shirts? And the answer was, yes! And so I packed up and I went back down to Alabama, and we cut up those T-shirts and more T-shirts and sewed them back together and shipped them to stores like Barney's New York, Brown's in London, Fred Siegel, Ron Herman in Los Angeles, Barney's in Tokyo. We had sold 8 stores that first season, really kind of by accident. And so we went home and made those shirts and shipped them out a month or two later. And every shirt from Barney's sold in about 3 weeks. And Barney's called back and said, where's fall? So I found myself in a fashion business. So my project became my project became a fashion line called Project Alabama. We were covered in Vogue very shortly after that time, and you have to think about how surreal this is. You know, you're in Vogue, but I'm working like in the basement of this, still in this 3-bedroom brick house on the side of County Road 200. You know, the T-shirts, the collection did really, really well. There was like a spiral of growth where it was almost doubling every season. You know, and it became very stressful, right? So I went from producing this kind of, this idea of a multimedia project to really running a fashion business and a production enterprise. So, you know, the company really established itself as a design build. So everything that we designed, we made ourselves, which is very unusual in the fashion industry today. And we just continued to grow. We were still working with a group of artisans that in about an hour-and-a-half radius of my little town in Florence. So some of our artisans lived up in Tennessee and some on down in Mississippi. About halfway through, so in about 2003, there was a knock on the door one day, and there were 6 men standing at the door, and it was the Department of Labor. And it was kind of a shock. I tell the joke the other day, I always used to say, you know, I'm down in Alabama, we're in Vogue, I'm having this moment with these ladies embroidering. It's like, you know, I'm having my Oprah moment. We're doing this, everything that we're doing is good, right? We're bringing jobs back to our community, and we're helping to bring light to the collapsed textile industry in the Southeast. We're doing all these things that feel so right, and then suddenly it's like I'm Martha Stewart, you know? Because labor law is federal labor law. There is no statute of limitation for labor law, and I came to find out that it is against the law for women to sew clothes in the home by the hour. And so this set us off on a whole another adventure where with labor law and lawyers and you know, eventually we came to figure this out. And I was saying to Dan the other day, this is really one of the things, you know, I never imagined in a million years when I was in design school that I would be using information technology and design our information design to be able to help solve labor law, right? It's amazing. And years later, we were asked to work on a project for the State Department to help try to figure out how to make cottage industry sustainable in third world countries. So using economics as a way. This was a project for the Global AIDS project, the Global AIDS Fund project. For economic empowerment. And so, I mean, this was a really scary time for me, and it cost a lot of money to be able to figure this out. But we were able to establish a system so that our artisans could become true independent contractors, could work in the field, and we can continue with the manufacturing in the way that we had set up with this centralized production facility and artisans in the field sewing. But what happened was the company continued to grow, and so you have to imagine that you know, we went from, you know, this little first sales of $8,000 to selling $2 million and having to produce it with local artisans, and it just cracked open so many problems, right? This idea of fast growth is like a monster that creates its own cycle, and what happened was the cycle eventually collapsed, right? The idea of labor law, the idea of fast growth, all of these things contributed to Project Alabama not working out in the way that I originally intended it. And so really at the height of our at the height of our success in Project Alabama, there was a photo early on. We had done our very first fashion show. We were on the cover of Women's Wear Daily. We had more orders than we had ever had. We had to shut the artisan system down. My business partners wanted to send the work to India, which was not something that I really wanted to do. And so the company came to a point where it was really at heads. It had to go one way or the other. And I was 44 years old. I had a 6-month-old baby and $5,000 in the bank. That was the only thing I had really been able to save from Project Alabama days. And so I took that $5,000 and all of the pieces of and parts of Project Alabama were kind of broken apart. The computers were put out in a yard sale. All of the pieces that we had bought, the intellectual property was being organized to be divided up between the partners. And I took my $5,000 and I had to make a decision. Am I going to go on or not? And I know there are a few people here who've been to our production facility, but I laid in bed that one night, and I think as a designer, as an artist, as an entrepreneur, you reach these stages where you really have to make very hard decisions, and I think that's one of the things that people don't talk about. I wish I had known some of this at that point, but. I really had to ask myself on my deathbed, would I feel like I had done everything I could do to make this work? And I went back in the next day, and two of the employees in the company came to me and they said, "Natalie, do not let this stop. We can do this. We've got this." And suddenly, it wasn't just me. It was two of us. And we took the money, the $5,000, out to the yard sale, and we bought the pieces, and we moved them back in the building, and we started up the next day as Alabama Chanin. And that has been a journey that has really become exactly that thing that I wanted it to be. I stood in the Art Institute the other day and looked out over the beautiful space, and I said to Dan, I am very lucky, right? Very, very lucky to have been able to build a company that I'm proud of from the ground up. So we bought what we could. We rethought how we were doing business, and pretty much everything that we had done before, we put under a microscope and re-examined it. We thought about the difference between recycled materials and organic cotton, and found that actually the organic cotton had a smaller footprint than the recycled materials did. And so we started this whole long process of sourcing American cotton from seed to shelf and combining that with our recycled fabrics. We figured out a way to implement lean method manufacturing, so not making anything until there was an order for it, and even reducing the size of our samples so that even samples were much, much less. We made choices for seasonless fashion, so we don't follow the typical fashion cycle. We choose to do, we try to do 2 collections a year, but sometimes we don't make it, and sometimes we have 3. So we do what we can, and we launch as we can. A very important thing happened in the middle of all this called the Internet. It's hard to remember that the Internet really isn't that old. It's kind of a baby still. When I started Project Alabama in 2001, only one of the people that we worked with had an email address. Right? It's kind of crazy to think, right? When Alabama Chanin reopened in 2006, we built a little tiny website ourselves, and we were one of the very few fashion companies that had a website in 2006, right? That's less than 10 years ago, right? Doesn't that feel a little shocking? Huh? But it's the truth, right? A lot of fashion companies didn't have websites until 5 years ago. Right? It feels like it's been forever this way, but it wasn't. And so we use this as a way to reach out. We started a little online store immediately. Many of our customers who had been customers before came back and supported us. Many people who had purchased the clothes before became patrons and came and supported us and continued to buy the clothes. And piece by piece, we built the company back up. And Project Alabama had, we had accrued some debt around the company, and many fashion companies work in what is called a factoring system. So when you get orders, you sell those orders to get money to be able to produce those orders. So before you've ever even produced your orders, you've already paid part of that money, as a loan or a fee for a loan. And so when we reopened, I said I'm not going to do that. And so we operated until very recently the company on a cash basis. And so the growth, it was not possible when you operate on a cash basis for this kind of this spiral of growth. You really you build as you can. And we made some really great decisions, and we continued to add to our team, and we really incorporated our team to in a very transparent way within the company. I even want to say today, in 2012, we wrote a vision for the company-wide. Everybody, no matter what their job in the company, was allowed to, or not allowed to, but asked to participate in that process. Through a company called Zingerman's, we learned a lot about how this can happen. And the day we finally finished the vision. It took about a year and a half to write the vision. The day we finished the vision and signed off, everybody in the company signed off on it, our life just began to explode. And so today, that brings us to A. Chanin. Pretty much the day after we signed the vision, the man who owns the building, we're in a building in the industrial park on the outskirts of Florence, Alabama. It's really, when I say we're in an old factory, most people think, oh, beautiful old windows and light, but it was a building, it's more or less a metal building that was built in 1982. It was built by Tennessee River Mills. And then purchased later by a company called TJ's, which was the largest T-shirt manufacturer in America at that time. My little community, I came to find out after I moved home, was once called the T-shirt manufacturing capital of the world. In our building, 600 women worked on machines, and Stephen, who was the third employee from Project Alabama, still works with me. He used to manage that floor right after he graduated from college. He went to work there. And many of the women who have worked with us over the years have at one time or another worked on that factory floor. So it's been really interesting to, in 2007, we moved out of the little house on the side of County Road 200, which had been a great and wonderful home for us, and really brought so many great things to us. The day we moved, I cried because I thought it would never be the same, but now we have this beautiful factory where my friend Kathy, who owns Heath Ceramics, likes to call it the hum of making. So when you walk in, you can hear the hum of things happening and scissors cutting and machines going. So the man who owns the building, Mr. Wiley, came in right after we had signed the vision to say, I'd really like to buy a few machines. I know we've talked about this for a long time, how sad it is that manufacturing just went away forever, but maybe we can do something about that. So now we have about 30 machines in the building, and we have 5 women sewing on A. Chanin. It's our machine-made line, but we're also doing production for companies like Billy Reed, and we did a big project for Patagonia last year. It's pretty exciting. We have a cafe, which is really wonderful. It serves all local seasonal ingredients. We do workshops, so another part of the business is teaching these techniques. very early on, I realized that we had to train our artisans in a way, because these techniques of hand sewing and hand embroidery, when we first started working with the artisans, the majority, so 95% of the artisans, were 45 years old or older. Today, we have artisans that range in age from 20 to 80. So, education and sustaining these traditions, these kind of cultural traditions, have been really key component to both Project Alabama and Alabama Chanin today. Hence the books that we wrote. So we've written books, we have workshops, we have our cafe. We have a store in the front of the cafe, which, seemed to me like such a funny thing to do, to open a store in Florence, Alabama. But it's been a really wonderful place for the community, first off for the community to be able to come in and see what we're doing and interact with the pieces. I think when we first opened the store and the cafe, we realized that so many people in our community did not even know that we were there. And on the other side, it's really funny because people drive in from all over America and actually fly in from all over the world to come and eat lunch there and shop at the store. So it's been a pretty amazing experience. We just completed as a company, so at the time that we started our vision, our 10-year vision for the company, we were 5 employees, and by the time it was finished, we were 15. We're now about 35 employees, and we have about 40 artisans who work in the field. So that little $5,000 investment back in 2006 has really grown into this very big, or feels to me very big. I know there are a lot bigger companies in the world. We're really a small business, but so we just started a strategic planning this year. It's the first time, and it was a really great piece of work, and something that we realized that through the years I've become much more an entrepreneur and much more running the business than having time to design. And so one of the most exciting things that came out of that strategic plan was that we're going to put design back to the forefront and really work this next year on really expanding our designs and pushing that process of design. So it's really funny, I said at the beginning that I'm the most least likely person coming from a place like Florence, Alabama, in a time that I did when there was no notion of art or design, to really come full circle. I've come back to my community and I've brought this with me, and never was my design career so fulfilling as it has been coming back to this place that's my home. And, thanks to the internet and thanks to, infrastructures that have changed tremendously the last few years, it's really been a way for us to really make an impact in a very small town in a very strong way. So that's my story. Thank y'all for listening. How'd I do, Dan? Did I come close to 45 minutes? I tell them, I'm a real storyteller, but when I get in a situation like this, I just plow through it. So has it been like 15 minutes? Or I sure hope y'all have been thinking up some questions for me, because are there any questions? Yeah, here. Oh, that's a really good question. The question was, how would I describe my artistic vision? I'm going to have to say to that is that I'm just learning to rediscover that now. A friend of mine, Zach Posen, once said you spend 5 minutes designing and 5 months producing, and that has been kind of the cycle. Even though we work in a slow design company, like Dan was saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that things are slow. And so I've really if you want to have your own collection and if you want to run your own business, you spend as much time with QuickBooks as you do with, art books. And so I'm looking forward to rediscovering what that vision is for me. Yes.
Just to follow up on the last question, you seem to have references to nature.
Yes.
In the work. Can you talk about that? Do you look local? Do you look at what's happening in Alabama in terms of local ornament or vernacular ornament?
Yes. I think, I said to someone once, there is definitely something called the Southern sense of place. And I was part of a group that was exploring the theme of pop culture recently, and I brought this theme up, and someone said, but there's a lot of space in Montana too. But I think there's this thing about the South, or the place that I live, is that you live very close to places that are still quite wild, right? And it's not everywhere, like especially when you live in a city, like you really have to make a concerted effort to go out into a place that may be a little scary, right? Because we're not used to these very loud woods. We're not used to these wild animals. And when you live in a place like I live, there's still quite a bit of wild around you. You can very quickly be in a place where you don't see anyone, right, for hours and hours and hours. And I'm not saying that this is what created the Southern sense of place, because there are libraries filled with this, smarter writers and smarter people than I am who try to understand this theme. But there is this kind of, the storms are really big, right? The woods are really wild. The bugs are really loud. And I think you can't help but be influenced by that when you're in that area. I did spend quite a lot of time in Europe as well. I spent 10 years in Europe, and a lot of people rightfully see that kind of influence in the work, this very ornamented fabrics that come from this idea of wallpaper and interiors. And, my background is very Bauhaus rooted, and I don't know if that's because I went to a school or I came through a curriculum that was rooted in that, or if it just always was a part of me. I've always felt that all things are so equal and all things are equally important. And so, I can be as inspired by a piece of furniture as this nature walk, right? And I feel like inspiration, I found a grocery list one time that was left in a cart, right? And it was the most beautiful thing, and so we blew it up, and it became like this one layer of this printed piece, right? Like everyday life is, I try to remember all the time that everyday life is miraculous and spectacular, and that there is inspiration, everywhere if you just take the time to look for it. Does that help? Okay. Yes. Okay.
No, it's okay.
This is the factory before we move the store in. Sorry to interrupt.
I noticed that you are starting to collaborate with other types of materials and other manufacturers.
Yes.
And, for instance, heat.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot to talk about heat. I'm so glad you brought that up because it's really important.
I've been in the ceramics and glass world in the United States for many years, so I understand that. But you are going to stay focused of product made in the USA and working with manufacturers only in the USA, or are you thinking about taking it elsewhere? And
there's a twofold answer to that. I think for the products that we make for Alabama Chanin, it has been really important to us to make those products in the USA. And, we're really proud of the supply chain from cottonseed to shelf. It was a really hard and long road, and everybody said to me it can't be done. and we did it, right? So, and we're not a huge corporation that has lots of money to invest in reestablishing the supply chain. So if we can do it, anybody can do it, right? But on the other hand, like those Patagonia jackets that we recycled weren't made in the USA, right? And so, but that's a really interesting project. And I have to say I'm quite fascinated by artisans in South America or Laos, we were talking about the other day. And so I think part of my personal vision would be that eventually there might be some sort of not-for-profit or other arm of Alabama Chanin where I could go out and use the skills that I've learned to be able to work in other countries, but in very focused, very responsible, sustainable ways. Would make me really happy. That's my retirement, I think. Hopefully. Knock wood. Hi.
Hi. You mentioned earlier in your remarks about starting in the 80s and when design was kind of becoming a capital D.
Yes.
So I have a two-part question. One is, how would you characterize the fashion industry now, and how do you think that your work kind of falls into that or doesn't fall into it?
I mean, you know, fashion is very big business, right? And, you know, the truth of the matter is that there's just way too much of it, right? There's just way too much. I mean, there are more clothes. I mean, there's a fantastic book called Deluxe, How Luxury Lost Its Luster. You know, I would recommend that to every student, to every designer. You know, there's just too much. And, you know, we're to the point now where we're making things that never will find a home, that just get burned to make more pollution. So there's pollution made in the making of them and pollution made in the disposing of them. And I love fashion, right? I love beautiful things, and I love things that are made beautifully. So it's hard for me to say that, right? And how we fit in that, I'm not really sure that we do. I think we're still trying to figure that out ourselves. You know, we don't sell very much wholesale right now, so most of our work is direct to consumer, which Heath has also done there. They've made this decision to sell direct to consumer. And, you know, I want to continue to make fashion because it really is what drives our business, but I don't want to make too much of it. And so I think, you know, one of the things that I say all the time is, like, you don't just decide to be a sustainable company and then you do it. It's like every single day you have to wake up and say, and question the decisions that you made again, right? Because the world it's all changing so quickly, right? Perhaps there's a better way to dye fabric today. Perhaps there's a better thread. Perhaps there's a better way to treat my employees. Perhaps there's more that we can do. And so I wish there were an answer for it. I think we're struggling. Not struggling. That's an awful word to use. The joy of this path is answering those questions every day. I hope that. Right? It's part of the design process, too, for me. Right? I've come to understand that I like those kind of puzzles. We call it puzzle magic around the office. I like puzzle magic, like being able to figure out how all these pieces fit together. Hi. I'm glad there's a question from back there.
You had mentioned the environmental process and like how you had picked organic cotton over recycled T-shirts because they left a lesser footprint.
Yeah.
Are you still looking into methods like that, considering how much water is it's such a dwindling resource?
You know, we should look into it more. I mean, I think that we use low impact dyes. We certainly try to do the best that we can, but we probably don't look into it enough. You know, if I were a bigger company, I would probably assign someone only to deal with that. You know, I'm really lucky in that I have Jill Dumaine, who's works in responsibility at Patagonia. I call her close friend, and so, I call her from time to time with questions like that. So the answer is we just try to do the best we can. I know in California that's a really big question, and they're going to have to face some really hard challenges this year in manufacturing. More? Yay. Keep them coming.
You had a lot of images of socks up there.
Yeah,
so I was
did
wondering
I?
if you can talk about some of the other industries you're looking to revitalize.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine the sock industry.
The socks are really awesome because that Fort Payne, Alabama, more socks were made in Fort Payne, Alabama than any place else in the world up until NAFTA, just like all the other textile industries in the South. And so those socks are made with our Texas cotton, so grown in Texas and dyed with low-impact dyes and produced in Fort Payne, Alabama, which is about an hour or 2 hour and 10-minute drive from our factory. So it's awesome. That's another seed to shelf product made in the USA. We're proud of them, and you know what? They are awesome. They really are. Like you've never worn a sock like that sock. I haven't in my life. Even my daughter, who is 9 years old, is like, those socks are amazing. They are. It's a great company that produces them. So.
Thanks for your talk. It's fantastic.
Thank you for saying that.
I once heard a farmer say if he really charged how much it would cost for a bunch of carrots, it would be really, really expensive, and people wouldn't buy it. So I was just curious. That was if he was able to afford health insurance for his workers. So I was curious if you could talk about the cost of labor and how you price your clothing and what that means.
That's a great question. So part of the Department of Labor investigation, we had to change the methods that we work with our independent contractors. So our independent contractors set the prices for the pieces that they sew. So we have a it's like a very simple, elaborate bidding system where all the projects that we have at any given time are sent out via email, are also available on a sheet in our office, and our artisans have access to that, and so they can see those projects that are available right now, but also every project that's been done for the last year to date, so every week, so they can look back an entire year. It doesn't say who the contractor was that received the project, but it shows what they bid for it, right? And so they turn in a set of bids, and then we have a production coordinator who awards those bids based on any number of factors, the first being quality, the second being timeliness, like some projects need to be done more quickly. Some of our artisans live about an hour and a half away, so it doesn't make sense for them to drive every day to our factory, so they take projects that maybe aren't due for a month or 6 weeks or something like that. And then all things being equal, she would award a bid based on price. And so we set our prices. We kind of know after 15 years about how much it's going to cost us to make a particular item. And, sometimes we make a little, sometimes we lose a little. It kind of fluctuates back and forth. We have to take that risk. And then the artisans, once they've placed the bid and been awarded the project, they purchase the raw materials from us. So our artisans, our independent contractors, are customers and vendors. So they purchase the raw materials from us in the form of a kit. We even sell kits online. So if you can't afford to make our garments, because they are extremely expensive, and very time-consuming. I have a really dear friend who's a chef. He always says it's not why it costs so much, it's why it's worth so much. But if you can't afford to make it, you can buy these DIY kits from our website and make it yourself. And so it's very much exactly the same as that. So if you go to our website and go to the School of Making, you'll see this little section. And our artisans, obviously we they purchase large quantities of kits and then sew those and bring them back to us. Does that make sense? And then, in terms of our pricing, yes, like if we used a traditional fashion industry markup, our prices would be much higher than they are. Our artisans get a pretty large percentage of the final cost of the product, and we make less. But we're in a situation where I live in Florence, Alabama. The cost of living in Florence, Alabama is very different than the cost of living in Chicago. And so it makes it possible for us, we don't have the kind of, you might look at our wages and say, oh, but nobody makes very much money. But the median salary for a family is about $35,000, right? And with that, you can live a very comfortable, beautiful life in this community. So it's complex. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces to your question. But I hope I answered it. Anybody else? Down here?
Just wanted to ask, regarding your environmental practice, was that always something that interested you? Beyond just you mentioned seeing the people in third world countries and how the fashion was produced through that. Were you interested in the environmental before that? I know you're interested in the preserving traditions, but beyond that, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of moving parts on that too. I lived in Europe for 10 years before I came home, and it was really it all started with the food. I came home and I would go to the grocery store and buy the food and eat it, and it just didn't taste right. My milk wasn't right, because I had been drinking milk from cows that are ushered up into the Alps in the summertime for vacation, right? They spend the summer on vacation, and then they're heralded back into the city with flowers adorning their necks and cow. That is like happy milk, right? And I got home, and the milk just didn't taste like milk. And, I started looking around, and it seemed to me there were so many things that were wrong about the way my community were, about the way we were doing things. The food didn't taste right. I was looking, I was in design in the fashion industry before, but I was never really that deep in production, aside from the things that I saw. But then I started seeing us cutting apart T-shirts and throwing all this stuff away and the kind of waste that went around it. And so it was kind of an awakening on all these different parts. Our little farmers market was just pitiful. Here we are, we lived in this amazing place, this close to nature, and all the food that was at the farmers market was being trucked up from Florida, which is a minimum of an 8-hour drive, right? And I looked back at my childhood, and remember I talked about that circling back to the beginning. I know what a tomato is supposed to taste like, and it is like an Alabama tomato, and I will take anybody down from Mississippi in here, but the Alabama tomato is the best tomato in the world, right? So why were we eating hard Florida-grown tomatoes? And so this just cracked open all these questions, and I think, obviously I'm not on this path alone. There were other people asking the same sort of questions at the same time, and I have a very curious mind, and so one thing led to another, and it just became an obsession. But the Alabama tomato still wins.
Time for one more question?
No, maybe two.
I just wanted to return to your point about there being too much fashion or too much clothing in general.
Yeah.
And perhaps, unpack that a bit more to say perhaps, the real issue is there's too much cheap fashion and that we have an obsession with very inexpensive clothing, which is obviously driving some of the unethical practices.
Yeah.
I wondered whether, from your perspective, you see any kind of ray of light when you look at some of the companies involved in mass production, and maybe it seems to me that what you've learned from your own practices would be very valuable in advising companies like that.
Yes, it is. I feel very honored. We were able to help a very large organization establish some guidelines for their global sustainable practices, right? And so, yes, I feel like I have learned a lot in that. I've busied myself with this for 15 years, and I'm really, really proud of that, But we were having this conversation yesterday. It's so easy to point your finger at the corporation, but I do a lot of lectures, and I think that, in my opinion, education, it's going to come down to education, because the consumer has the power, right? So I tell high school students, like, if you choose a candy bar with chocolate and peanuts, and everybody in this room chooses chocolate and peanuts, they're going to make more candies that have chocolate and peanuts. So you vote with every dollar that you spend, you vote. And you vote for what you want. And as long as the consumer continues to vote, there are going to be corporations that continue to provide. But if you, boycott, if you make a boycott and everybody refuses to vote for, a T-shirt that's made in an unsafe condition, then they will stop. Because they want to sell things. Right? And so the corporation will either go away or it will readjust itself to provide the consumer with what they want. And I think we've never been at a better time also because of the internet. There's, every day there's more transparency. Like what happened in Bangladesh, it's 2 years on Friday. It's a great thing. Turn your clothes inside out on Friday. Show everybody who made your clothes, right? But that kind of thing probably happened before, but we didn't know about it, right? So now there's this incredible transparency, so it's an incredible opportunity to hold people responsible. Like those labels that were being sewn in the clothes were photographed on the ground, right? And in the news and spread globally, in seconds, right? So, it was very obvious who was manufacturing there. And so you can choose, just like, in the South with BP, with the oil spill, everybody in the South, we were strongly affected by that. And so, we made decisions based on that. Not saying it changes those practices, but if we have incredible power. Sorry, I ran on and on. There was one more question.
Thank you. I too wanted to echo. Thank you for coming. I'm so glad to hear you talk. I heard you speak once before. But you spoke about the shift after your strategic meeting and you moving more to the design and started with your baby, so to speak.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on how is that move going to happen, but you'll still have, an entrepreneurial spirit with maybe partners or team members? And then second, you talked about the internet being so great. I followed the fact that you had a partnership with Craft South and some things that are happening, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the energy around that and how you see that.
Okay. Well, the strategic plan is still, going to play itself out. The beautiful thing about this is, okay, so I'm 55 years old, and I still have hopefully many great working years ahead of me, but the company has grown a lot, and I feel very responsible for this wonderful team that we have, right? And I want them to be able to carry this on and to keep their jobs for forever. So, we have to make some really smart decisions about how that succession happens. And because first off, they need me in design, and second off, at some point they're going to have to phase me out, or as I like to tell them, everybody pops off sometime, so better make a plan. But, the strategic plan, the strategic plan and writing by engaging the entire company, whether it's, somebody who serves in a cafe, or our production coordinator, or our 12 for Life student who is a high school student that works a half day every day. By involving everybody in the plan, I like to say, I told them the other day, we're all in the same airplane and we're flying in the same direction. And so it's amazing how people who weren't so interested in stepping up to the plate, or maybe didn't know what to do because I didn't articulate what they needed to do, suddenly it was like a light went off and everybody saw oh, this is what I need to do, or I can help here, I can help there. And immediately, I have more time. The company saved more money. We changed everything around to, implemented a profit share, so if there's money left at the end of the year, it's for everybody, right? And so we're all part and parcel of this. It belongs to us. It belongs. Somehow I see the company as it's bigger than me, right? It belongs to the community in ways that I never saw coming. I was kind of blindsided by that, right? But it's beautiful. Okay.
Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for coming.
One is really just an observation, and it's the use of the word "we" when you talk about your company, your organization, and the importance of that. I think particularly for many of these audience members being students and thinking about growing their business, right now it's just about the I and the importance of the we and that collaboration to build a brand, to build a sustainable brand. So really my question is, what is your legacy? What do you hope to leave behind?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that I've ever thought about that. I mean, maybe I have. Maybe that's being trite. I really hope for the company, it would be wonderful if it could carry on for them and they could continue to develop working relationships in that community, if manufacturing could become an integral part of America again. I always said, I grew up in a time where, we were a nation of makers. We made the most beautiful things in the world. People wanted our cars. They wanted our refrigerators. They lasted a lifetime. And I find, some of this stuff, someone asked me once, is there a political agenda here? And I said, well, maybe in a grassroots kind of way. That's the nation. I want to be a part of that nation, right? There's a kind of pride that we maybe don't have today that we had when I was growing up. And I'm not talking about nationalistic pride. It's something totally different. It's like pride in self, pride in community, right? And if I could just scratch the surface of that, then I will hopefully have made an impact, or my life would have meaning, right? So, thank you. Thank you all.